Good afternoon. My name is Melinda Herring. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Ukraine Alert blog at the Atlantic Council, and we are delighted to be a partner of the Kyiv Security Forum. I'd just like to thank Danila, our good friend here, for our partnership and friendship. It's always a pleasure to be in Kyiv. This is the best organized and most interesting conference in Ukraine, so thank you for making us #1 on the sign. We really appreciate it, but honestly, thank you so much. It's no exaggeration to say that Washington, D.C. is very weird right now, and the mood is very unusual. You are sitting in front of a very experienced panel. We're so lucky to have people who have served in very high levels of government, and we're going in, as well as some academics, and we're hoping for a really exciting discussion. We have invited someone who will try to give us some perspective on the Trump administration as well as some critics. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce my panel. To my right is Ambassador John Herbst, the director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council, Ambassador Sandy Vershbow, also at the Atlantic Council, Dr. Celeste Wallander, who's the president of the U.S.-Russia Foundation, Will Ruger from the Koch Foundation, and my final panelist is Professor Stephen Stostanovich from Council of Foreign Relations and Columbia University. Welcome to you all. Thank you for being here. So let's get into it. We've got a great panel. I'm going to start with Professor Stostanovich. How does Donald Trump see the world? How do you describe his foreign policy broadly?
Melinda, I think your term weird for what's going on in Washington is very appropriate, and it gives us an opportunity to do something that Americans don't always do. Which is to be very modest about our political situation and our political institutions. We typically often are accused of going to other countries and lecturing them about how you ought to run a government. I won't even say anything more about why we're not in a position to do that. I think it's very clear how Donald Trump views the world and has been for a long time. If I could distill it, it's that he believes that the global order that arose after the Cold War ended was conducted and at America's expense. So his view is that we've been cheated by allies and trading partners, and that the question is how to get even and start winning. That it's been described often as a very dark view of the world, and I think that's right. But the view of the world is not the interesting part of it, because we've known that for a long time. The question is how that view would be implemented, how it would turn into policy, how rhetoric and practice would match up. And we still don't really know the answer to that. The policy doesn't match the rhetoric because policy never really matches the rhetoric. But sometimes that's because you've got cool, careful, calculating implementers of policy. In this case, it's because you've got an extremely headstrong president with very little experience, very divided advisors, a confrontational style that involves challenging other people, making them uncomfortable. And the result is a kind of confusion about whether the view of the world is going to be implemented. And, you know, on some days we will see that it is, and some days we'll see that it isn't. But I think the core question, Donald Trump's view of the world, that's easy.
Is it possible to speak of a doctrine? Maybe you're a professor, so help us here for a minute. What are the 3 schools of foreign policy, and does he fit into one of those?
There's no Trump doctrine because the administration is too divided and because the president couldn't give you the answer if you gave him all day. The president, as I said, has an instinct. He thinks other people are taking advantage of the United States. And that means, I mean, let me be concrete about it. He thinks trading partners have cheated the United States, and he thinks allies have cheated the United States. Europeans have the unfortunate distinction of being in both categories. They're the closest allies and the closest trading partners, and that means the president really doesn't like them. It's not a surprise, but the question of what the president will do to make that dislike a reality, you tell me. There is no Trump doctrine because Trump doesn't have anybody who has his view around him. He has people who have their own views, but he doesn't impose it.
Okay. Let's bring in Dr. William Ruger, Vice President for Research and Policy at the Koch Institute, a libertarian organization in Washington. Same question, Will. How would you describe Trump's foreign policy broadly? And do you agree with Dr. Sestanovich? Is it possible to speak of is there a doctrine?
Well, I think there are elements of what we might call realist restrainer sympathies, and then there are elements of the kind of same old primacist approach that we've had since the end of the Cold War. And this was evident right from the beginning. So at his Mayflower speech, there were kind of two parts of that, right? The first part was relatively restraint-oriented, a kind of vision of America being a little bit more prudential in the world. That was kind of the America First part. And then there was another part that was, again, much more of a kind of muscular, primacist approach that, again, has been consistent with American foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. And so I think that there's been that tension within the Trump administration from the beginning, both within Trump and then obviously within his staff, because the people that he brought on board as part of his administration, I don't think that they really shared the president's instincts, if you want to call them, or some of his views. And that's been a kind of problem with implementation, even on the things where it's been clear what the president wants.
Okay, let me follow up with you. What are the strengths of Trump's foreign policy? If you were going to make a case for the last 2 years, let's hear it.
I mean, look, compared to his predecessors, the kind of bar is pretty low, to be honest. I mean, the biggest thing is that you had the lack of any major new intervention. If you think about it, so Obama strongly plussed up troops in Afghanistan and really doubled down on the nation-building project there. He also did Libya, which was an absolute catastrophe of a conflict that has had ramifications today when it comes to our anti-proliferation policy and the stability of North Africa, which has also affected Europe. If you think about George W. Bush, a disaster in foreign policy in many ways, highlighted most prominently by the Iraq War. And then Bill Clinton before that, in terms of Kosovo, in particular. So what we've had is we've had a president that hasn't had a big new intervention, and that's a major plus. I'd also say that he's broken up and broken open the conversation in Washington. And so even if he doesn't have a doctrine, maybe there's a lot of different elements to his approach, it has allowed Washington, I think, to consider issues that it needed to consider back when the Cold War ended, and which have really, I think, were unfortunately hardened in the post-Cold War world. And I think that's been an important result of Trump. You could also say that he's pushed on alliance burden sharing, and as Mike Desch of the University of Notre Dame has put it, it might have been ham-handed, but it was an important thing to do. And then if you think about Syria and Afghanistan, now he tweeted about withdrawing from both places. Syria appears to be stalled, but we have seen some withdrawal. And then in Afghanistan, we'll see what happens, but it looks like Ambassador Khalilzad is going to bring a withdrawal or a negotiated settlement back from Afghanistan. And that would be a positive, because I think the United States needs to decrease its footprint in the Middle East. And so again, we could argue with maybe the methods or his kind of style, but some of the results haven't been all that bad.
Okay, I'm going to let someone respond to you. I'm going to ask Ambassador Vershbow. Would you like to respond to that? What are the weaknesses of Donald Trump's foreign policy?
Well, I think that it's the total incoherence, which I would start with. He doesn't really have a clear policy on most of the major issues. It actually has come out not so bad on some very important issues, such as on Russia, where you have a Trump administration, distinct from Trump himself, which has set forth in the national security strategy a very realistic priority of great power competition, identifying Russia and China as the two major great power competitors who are directly challenging the whole international order and challenging U.S. interests. And this is translated into a policy which is not all that different, maybe a little more robust here and there than in the previous administration, in terms of continuing with sanctions, continuing to support Ukraine's sovereignty, even giving Ukraine lethal weapons, which Obama refrained from, coming down very hard after the Skripal attacks and continuing to sanction the Russians for interfering in our election, even though Trump doesn't think the Russians did that. He's bolstered deterrence in NATO and spending more money and putting more U.S. troops on the ground in Europe. So the Trump administration has a pretty respectable policy. But Trump's commitment to this policy is always in doubt. And I think that's true on a number of issues. He considers the whole Russian interference thing a hoax. And there was authoritative reports that early on during the administration he was looking to unilaterally remove most of the sanctions imposed after the invasion of Ukraine. He was blocked by the Congress, who was basically taken away his freedom of maneuver on sanctions. But then we saw the somewhat bizarre press conference in Helsinki, and the fact that he has meetings with leaders with no preparation, no clear objectives, no witnesses who can actually figure out what actually might have happened. So no disaster on those fronts has happened, but we live in constant fear, sitting on the edge of our chairs, that some total capitulation or sweetheart deal will be given to one of the strongmen that he is so fascinated by, and it'll be hard to pick up the pieces. But that hasn't happened yet.
Dr. Wallander, to say that there's confusion about U.S. policy toward Russia and Ukraine is an understatement. What do you think the policy is, and why is there so much confusion?
Well, I think I would agree with what Ambassador Vershbow laid out, but I would widen the parameters of what is important to understand, which is a lot of the hardline policies on Russia that you're seeing is not because of being hard on Russia. It's to not be considered to be weak at on Russia in American politics. In other words, because of the suspicion of Russian interference in the election, because of, the fact of Russian interference in the election, and the suspicion that Russia may have not been acting alone and may have, in fact, had help in American political circles, it becomes really important to prove that you're tougher on Russia than anyone else. And a lot of the congressional action is about that. So the good news is, if you think the United States should have a tough policy on Russia, there are a lot of constituencies that are trying to prove how tough they are. The problem is it's not actually about a strategy, and it's not actually about American national interests. And that's what I worry about. And I take what Will's saying about the restraintism as opposed to the overcommitment, and that's something the United States always should be reevaluating. But American foreign policy after the Cold War was driven by a concept of the national interest, which was America first. Every country should put the interests of its country first. But it was an understanding that the United States, while advancing American interests first as our responsibility, would do so in a global liberal order in which we encouraged others to cooperate with us to achieve common goals. And that even the United States at the height of the Cold War, as the most powerful country in the world in confronting the Soviet Union, couldn't do it alone. And what has happened in the last couple of years under the kind of chaotic foreign policy is that the America first has turned into America alone. And that is really problematic because it is unpredictable in general, because it's driven by our politics instead of a strategic approach to the world, whether that's a more restraint and realist view or the more kind of traditional liberal view. It's unpredictable, and it is kind of at the whim of one man, and that's not how democracies are supposed to build their foreign policy. I used to teach, and one of the main lectures I would do at the beginning of the semester was to explain to students how in democracies, foreign policies are supposed to reflect the will of the electorate, the country as a whole, and to advance the national interest, not the personal interest. And in authoritarian countries, like Russia, it's not surprising when you see foreign policy advancing the interests of narrow groups, like Putin's cronies or the security services, because those aren't accountable. But what we have in the United States now is we have a mix of all these different constituencies which are trying to push and pull, I think, American foreign policy in the direction of a broader national interest, and somebody who has the ability on a given day to come out and announce that, in fact, contrary to international law and a long tradition of American foreign policy, the United States is going to recognize Israeli effective sovereignty over the Golan Heights. And I would put to you that you can't be sure that this president wouldn't come out one day and to decide to recognize Russian effective sovereignty over any of the territories it occupies. And that's the challenge we all face, because we have an American foreign policy that's being driven by one person and whim instead of a strategy rooted in the national interests of the United States.
Dr. Wallander, who's been tougher on Russia and better on Ukraine, Obama or Trump?
I don't like the question.
I know you don't.
Not because I am not proud of what we achieved. We achieved.
And the same question is coming to you next, Dr. Sestanovich.
So in 2014, the immediate reaction, first of all, there was disbelief in Europe. I spent a lot of time in Europe in March, April, May, and June talking to European governments to explain what was going on. The covert intervention. It took a long time to convince Europeans, and some Europeans weren't convinced until the horrific shoot-down of Malaysian airliner 17 all the way in August. So we brought together a coalition of Europeans and a lot of Americans who didn't want to believe. We were the first administration to impose sanctions on Russia for its violation of international law. It had been violating international law for years before, but we were the first administration when Russia cut to the very heart of international law, the UN Charter, the sovereignty in territorial integrity, and the refusal to change borders through the use of force. We put together the coalition of not just the EU, but also the G7 countries, first kicking Russia out of the G8. That was President Obama's decision. And we put together sanctions that hit the Russian economy, that first hit people around Putin, because you don't want to hit the average Russian citizen because it's not a democracy. That's not going to be effective. In an oligarchy, you want to hit the people who are close to decision-making. So we crafted sanctions that went after the people who mattered. And then we hit 3 sectors of the Russian economy: finance, defense, and future investment in energy. And we got the Europeans on board. Those sanctions not only hurt the Russian economy, they hurt European economies. And it was a long and tough negotiation to get them on board. And it was after the imposition of those sanctions in September of 2014 that you finally got a pullback. And I was under no illusions that it was a cave-in, but a pullback of the Russian operations in the Donbass, and an attempt on the part of Europeans to get a lasting ceasefire, which, as we all know, has never been correctly implemented under Minsk. But it created the breathing space for you in Ukraine to build a defense capability that you have effectively deployed on the line of contact since. The Ukrainian military could not take the time to reorganize itself and to train to have an effective defensive line until that very imperfect ceasefire, the presence of the SMM, the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission, and the pressure coming from Europe and the transparency that we were able to impose. So I know it didn't end the war, and I would never claim we did enough to end the war, but we created, in support of Ukraine, the breathing space for you to begin to fight Russia effectively on your own. And I am proud of that. And I'm glad that the Trump administration has continued those policies, and I hope they continue to do so.
Thank you very much. I told you that Dr. Wallander is the president of the U.S.-Russia Foundation, but what I left out is that she was the senior director for Russia at the National Security Council in the Obama administration. Dr. Sestanovich, I'm going to ask the same question. I'm going to bring him in just a minute. Dr. Sosanovic, who was tougher on Russia? You're our
I've been really critical of the Obama administration in lots of different ways, but I have also said that I thought by the end of the administration, Europe was the most successful arena of the Obama administration's foreign policy in response to the crisis in Ukraine, and I think it is right to measure administrations by their response to crisis. I think you can say broadly, and I'm not going to cite the individual actions that Celeste took, or that she described, but I'd put it generally. I think the Obama administration actually managed to revitalize NATO and to create a transatlantic consensus on Ukraine and on Russia policy that had not existed before. It was a pretty coherent policy. And I think in the context of that moment, it was a very impressive achievement. The Trump administration has been tougher in one way, offering lethal assistance, but in another way, I tend to describe the Trump administration's policies as they do the opposite of Obama. So Obama and Putin didn't get along. So what's Trump's policy? Like Putin. Obama didn't want to give weapons to Ukraine. So what's Trump's policy? Give weapons to Ukraine. I said that the Obama administration's policy was pretty coherent. I think the Trump administration's policy doesn't have a coherence that comes from a kind of conception of the problem that you have to solve. It's just trying to figure out, in this case, how to do what Obama didn't, or how to kind of act on, somebody used the word whims of the president. Could I add one other thing here, Melinda? I'm sorry to hog the floor. I'm worried that we're going to alarm this audience with our picture of the horrors of Washington. And I...
Give us some hope, okay?
If you're disturbed, I understand it. I know you do.
Some foreign spice to feel a bit better about ourselves as well.
Well, but I want to tell you something that I hope will cheer you up, not just because we're in terrible shape. It's that we actually still have a lot of people in Washington who have the right ideas about American foreign policy. I think there's a kind of consensus, and in fact, I would say it's almost regrettable how much consensus there is. Because at a time when we needed to debate American foreign policy, what we've done is just criticize the president. Because the president's views are so outlandish that the only responsible thing to do is criticize them. What we need to be doing is having more of a debate about where American foreign policy should be headed.
Okay. On that note, let's bring in Ambassador Herbst. Ambassador Herbst, you've been very patient. What's the political context of Trump's foreign policy?
There are a number of things here that are important to understand. The easiest one has already been mentioned by Celeste, which is that in part because of the question of possible collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians, Russia is a particularly toxic subject in Washington today, which has led to stronger policies against Kremlin revisionism and in support of Ukraine. So it's been a positive factor in terms of where policy needs to go as far as I'm concerned, but that factor is not driven by dispassionate analysis of American foreign policy interests. But there's another element here which is really important, which is not understood. Trump won in 2016, roughly speaking, and I'm simplifying, for two reasons. Everyone understands the domestic reason, which was that an important part of the American population had not done well even in the 1990s and certainly in this century. And their interests were largely ignored by both political parties, with the exception of, among the Democrats, Bernie Sanders, who did not emerge as the nominee for a variety of reasons, and on the Republicans by Donald Trump. I'm talking about working class Americans whose standard of living, in fact matter, whose regular jobs were severely jolted over the past 20 years. But there was a second factor, not nearly as important politically, but very important for the conversation we're having today. And that comes back to what Steve just said. There was a fat and stupid American foreign policy elite which had not learned from the debacles of the preceding 16 years. I would not put the Clinton administration in that category, although Will did, which is understandable given where he comes from. But the foreign policy of the Bush II administration, meaning younger Bush, and I voted for him. So, I'm not, so I thought he had a good idea when he was a candidate. I didn't think he had such a good idea once he became president. The policies in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we had to go into Afghanistan, we didn't have to go in the way we did, were a disaster. And the Republican Party never learned about those disasters. So McCain ran against Obama in 2008, wanting to repeat our wonderful successes in the Middle East and Iran. And on the Democratic side of the House, while Obama understood this, and that was one reason why he won in 2008, his party didn't. The Republicans had the neoconservatives, the Democrats had the liberal interventionists, and the liberal interventionists never understood that these policies were a disaster. And Obama did not want to go into Libya, and we can talk about this, but he went in because all of his foreign policy advisors were pushing him. And to this day, Hillary Clinton will tell you Libya was a success, which is the foreign policy reason why she lost to Trump. And in fact, there's some serious continuities in the instincts, to use Steve's correct phrase with regard to Trump, Obama, of course, being more cerebral, the instincts of the two presidents, Trump and Obama. And the one solitary thing that Trump has done in terms of American political thinking about foreign policy was to destroy the monopoly of the neocons on Republican foreign policy, to open up a debate, and also to provide space for at least some people in the Democratic Party to break away from the liberal interventionists who also had almost as comparable hegemony in the Democratic Party. But, and this comes back to the politics of all this, because Trump is such a divisive figure, no one's going to give him credit for it, or very few people, so maybe Tucker Carlson on Fox News will give him credit for it, but no one else will give him credit for this. And therefore, the legitimacy of this debate is not quite understood. But it's very important, and that is an achievement of his. And I say that as someone who could not get a job in the Trump administration because I signed a letter in this fall of 2016 criticizing him because what he said about NATO just drove me over the top. I said, no, this is really bad. Last point, very, very important. Celeste mentioned, with Steve nodding vigorously, and I think all of us except Will in agreement, that a great achievement of American foreign policy was the creation of the liberal international order. While we paid a larger cost for this than anybody else, it was very much in our interest, even with us paying that larger cost. But first of all, to sell this concept is not so easy, it's abstract. But the elites that believe in this and nurtured it are the same elites that didn't understand our frails in the Middle East, which the American public understood. So when Trump came along knocking at the legs of the liberal international order, the elites did not have much authority with the American public to defend it, because they had been so bad on stuff which the American public understood, meaning that, hey, we really don't want to repeat in Iran what we did in Iraq. And for that matter, Iraq was no success. And so the failures of the fathers, meaning in the foreign policy elite, have been visited on the sons, and that has made this whole circumstance today much more difficult. So that was the main point I wanted to convey, and I'm happy now just sitting down.
I mean, I think one of the big problems here is that we've had presidents who have run on a more modest approach, right? So remember, Clinton was talking about it's the economy, stupid. George W. Bush said no nation building. You had Obama who said let's not do stupid stuff. And then you had Trump arguing for more realism in our foreign policy. And with the first three of those, you saw that our foreign policy was fairly aggressive. I don't think it lived up to the kind of liberal international or ordered part of the liberal international order. I mean, this is one of the, I think, things about Washington that's so frustrating, is that people talk all about this liberal international order, but they've supported lots of illiberalism and lots of things that cause disorder and things that aren't very international. And that violate international. I mean, so you think about in Libya, how liberal was it for President Obama not to go to Congress to get authorization for the use of force? How ordered was it to break the Middle East with our Iraq intervention? How liberal is it to support Saudi Arabia and their war in Yemen, which is bad for our interests and bad for our values? And we see this in many places. And I don't want to run down our country. I think our country is great. My argument is that our elites are not following, I think, what our national interests are. And I think that people recognize this, which is why they voted for candidates that had a more modest view. And I think they were attracted to Trump because they thought that he said things as he was campaigning about Iraq, when he went to South Carolina during the primaries and really went at Jeb Bush for the Bush family's tradition in foreign policy. And he lived to tell about it. And South Carolina is one of our more kind of military, patriotic, Republican states. And he went there and he actually won. And so I think Americans want to change to our foreign policy. And when Trump said, I don't want to have people in my administration who have fancy resumes but a record of failure, that's what inspired a lot of Americans. Unfortunately, the president, while he's done many good things in this area, has again largely followed some of the script of the Washington blob that Ben Rhodes talked about, your colleague.
Okay, look, that's the perfect segue to Ambassador Vershbolt. Ambassador Vershbolt, what is Trump's policy toward Russia and Ukraine?
Well, I think I already addressed that a little earlier in terms of the great power strategic competition as the framework in the national security strategy. And again, this is the Trump administration more than Trump himself. But I think it still is a strategy of containing Russia, of strengthening deterrence against Russian aggression, which is now a reality, of trying to prevent Russia from reestablishing its domination over countries like Ukraine, and using a pretty robust toolkit, including sanctions, military assistance to Ukraine, to that end. I think we've seen a tough line on Russian use of chemical weapons in the UK. So the administration is doing the right thing, but I agree with John's point that Trump is perhaps doing this more because of the constraints imposed by the Mueller investigation and Russiagate. With that now behind us, or sort of half behind us, it's not quite over yet, people are asking whether he's going to make another run towards some kind of détente with Putin, some kind of dirty deal at the expense of Ukraine or others. I don't think that's likely to be the case. He's, I think, focusing more on his re-election campaign. And I think he recognizes that Congress has thrown up enough roadblocks that it wouldn't be worth the domestic fight. So I don't think he believes in the policy that he's pursuing, but I think it's likely to remain the same at least through the end of this term.
If I could just follow up with you, some commentators argue that Trump doesn't believe in NATO. He doesn't think much of Article 5, and we know he's talked about leaving the alliance last year. The New York Times has reported that. Why is that his view? Why does he have such a low view of NATO?
Well, Trump takes a transactional view of just about everything, and I think he doesn't have the same traditional view that alliances have been a benefit for the United States, have been a force multiplier when we need to take military action, that they bring the political power of a group of democratic nations to give additional force to our policy and support us in critical international fora. He sees it purely as a protection racket. We protect you, you pay us. It's kind of like a krisha. And that's why he's so obsessed over the issue of defense spending and burden sharing. And while he has a point about that, the Allies have not lived up to the promise that they made, most importantly at the highest levels at the 2014 Wales Summit when they had accepted the goal of 2% of GDP. Some are performing, others are not. But he misses the larger point that there may be some reason for the U.S. to continue to tolerate this kind of imbalance because of the larger benefits that we get from having a strong NATO alliance and having allies who are willing to take risks, put troops on the ground, pay the ultimate sacrifice when the U.S. asked them to do. And the best example of that is the fact that the allies didn't hesitate to send thousands of troops to Afghanistan and have stayed there as long as we have, because I think they appreciate what the U.S. has done for them in the past, and that it's in their interest to uphold the Article 5 principle that an attack on one is an attack on all. So Trump doesn't have any of that sentimental attachment to NATO. It's all about the money. But so far, this is another example where the administration continues to pursue a line that's largely consistent with the Obama administration's, continue to strengthen NATO, put more troops and more money into the European Deterrence Initiative. I attribute a lot of that to former Secretary of Defense Mattis. He and other adults in the room are no longer there, but we have to keep our fingers crossed that Trump will allow this traditional policy to persist, even though he doesn't believe in NATO any more than he believes in the international rules-based order.
So you just mentioned that there's not very many adults left in the room, Sandy, and maybe, Will, you can come in here too. Who are Trump's main foreign policy advisors? Who does he listen to now? Would you like to take that, Will?
I mean, I don't have a monopoly of knowledge on who Trump listens to. I think Secretary Pompeo obviously is a strong voice in the administration. Obviously John Bolton is an important voice. I hope the president listens to Senator Rand Paul, who he plays golf with, I guess, because of the fact that I think Rand Paul wants to also, I think, change the direction of American foreign policy closer to one that focuses on America's safety, America's prosperity, and our liberal system at home, as opposed to, I think, what we've gotten ourselves into, which is debt and deficit, lots of wars, and an overextension of our commitments abroad. And so I hope he'd be listening to Senator Paul. But at the end of the day, I think President Trump's a very confident man, to say the least, and probably takes his own counsel foremost.
That was nicely put. Ambassador Herbst, if President Trump had taken a harder stance on Russia and expressed less receptiveness to Putin, would anything be different here in Ukraine today?
I think that, first, I agree with Steve that the Obama administration did a good job rallying Europe in one policy with us on Russia. However, I was also a sharp critic of that administration for not arming Ukraine and doing all these things faster. I would give the Trump administration a little bit more more credit than the Obama administration because of the Javelin decision and because of the heavy reaction, especially to Skripal, basically taking out the Russian intelligence presence on the American West Coast was a huge positive decision. I think that our overall policy towards Russia would be stronger if Trump's instincts were not peculiar. It is true that, again, the policy has gotten tougher over the past 2.5 years, but it's gotten tougher after periods of American embarrassment and confusion in Washington and in the alliance. Sandy referred to the peculiar summit and press conference in Helsinki last summer. I would add, actually I think you may have also referred to this, Sandy, to the very clear trial balloon that the Trump administration sent in late January of 2017 on easing sanctions, which pushed not just Congress, but also people in the administration towards a stronger sanctions policy. So all of these inconveniences and things which sow confusion would be missing. I'm not certain that the overall policy would be tougher. I would obviously appreciate if it were, but it's probably tough enough to restrain the Kremlin from going deeper into Ukraine and from escalating in a serious way. Although, let me make one point before I leave that hanging there. Our response after Kerch should have been faster, and it should have been tougher. It took us till April or March to issue sanctions, and those sanctions are rather weak. But other than that, it's not been bad.
Professor Sestanovich, what do you think? Same question. If Trump had taken a harder stance on Russia and he hadn't done his Helsinki dance, would anything be different?
Yeah, you know, my expectation at the beginning of the administration was that Putin had a chance to use a friendly relationship with Trump as a kind of cover for winding down a failed operation in eastern Ukraine. You know, the war in eastern Ukraine is a big loser for Putin. It's a failure. It's just a plain failure. And the question is, at what point would Putin recognize that? And I thought, in a funny way, this receptivity of Trump to get the idea of getting along great with Putin could have had a bit of a payoff. You know, Ukraine doesn't necessarily suffer from a good Russian-American relationship. But Trump so bungled his handling of relations with Russia that I think the Russians came to see that there was no point in trying to do business with him, because he could either be too hard or too soft, but too unpredictable for them to do a deal with him, or to use his policies as a kind of cover for retreat. So I think the issue isn't just would tougher policies or softer policies produce a good result. You need a very kind of skillful implementation. And to say the very least, that's not Trump's strong suit.
Dr. Wallander, I know you want to jump in. Go ahead, please.
So I just want to, with respect, disagree with Steve on the view in Moscow of its Ukraine policy. Yes, it hasn't achieved everything that the Kremlin wants. What the Kremlin wants is implementation of the Minsk agreement on Russian terms. It is not viewed in Moscow as a failure in the sense of a war that wasn't worth it. That is a tactical success, views it as a tactical success in Moscow, because in Moscow the view is that the war has stopped Ukraine from advancing towards its European path. And that is the reason for the war. The reason for that war was because Ukraine was going to sign the EU association agreement.
Can I just...
And down the road, possibly join NATO. And so, unfortunately for Ukraine, the Kremlin had learned the lesson in Transnistria and Abkhazia and South Ossetia that unresolved conflicts grind Russia's neighbors into failure, instability, and not on a European path. So that was the stake. And that was the reason for the invasion of Crimea, except then they made a mistake and they annexed Crimea, not legally, I know, believe me, I know. But then they didn't have that hook in Ukraine. So Donbass is that hook. So you are right to be careful about how the Kremlin wants to use the Donbass to keep hold of all of Ukraine. So I think that there is not a sense that they want to get out of this war. They do want what they want, which is they want a way to use that war to control Ukraine's foreign policy choices and its future. And while they may have entertained the thought, and I think they did entertain the thought, and I actually think they still entertain the thought that they might be able to get what they want out of President Trump, they have learned that they cannot get what they want out of the Trump administration. And I very much agree with what Ambassadors Herbst and Vershbow said about that.
Did you want to respond?
I'd just say one thing. It's very hard to talk to Russians about this policy and get an honest assessment, because to say that the war in eastern Ukraine is a failure is a massive criticism of Putin. And there are very few people who are brave enough to say that. But that, I believe, is the reality. And I believe you can coax that out of an honest Russian after a couple of drinks.
But those Russians don't make policy. And so for the Kremlin, it's a failure because they didn't get everything they wanted. But it's not a failure that they're going to give up on.
There are honest Russians who, after a couple of drinks,
Yes.
still have influence on policy.
we'll talk about who you think those are, because I think I know who does have influence, and I don't think they would say it's a failure. But anyway, we're playing with words here. I agree with you that the war is a failure in the sense that it has cost Russia a lot. And this gets back to the national interest versus the regime's interests. The war is in the regime's interests. The war in Ukraine is not in Russia's national interests. Russia does not have an interest in being kicked out of the G8, the Russian people, in being closed off from the international economy, and having foreign investors flee from, what should be a vibrant economy. And it is definitely not in Russia's interest to have Ukrainians not Russia's friend. So I agree with you, the war is a failure for Russia. I'm just saying I'm not sure it's a failure for the Kremlin, and that's an important distinction.
Okay, I want to ask a broader question, and then we're going to bring our audience in. This question is for Ambassador Herbst and for Dr. Ruger. So we've talked about how unusual Trump's foreign policy is. There's many American ambassadorial posts that are empty, and Trump has had unusual positions on NATO, on Europe. What's our image abroad now? Has Trump helped or hurt our image abroad? And if you think he's hurt our image abroad, can it be repaired? Yeah, Ambassador Herbst, please.
I think that the image of Trump and the United States is country and region specific. So if you ask the Saudi royal family, they love him. If you ask the Prime Minister of Israel, they love him. If you ask the administration in Brasilia, they love him. If you go to Germany, if you go to France, you get a different point of view. And probably, if you were to question most of the traditional friends of the United States, most of them would not be too enthusiastic about the president and the current state of American foreign policy. But it's also true that you have to talk about Trump administration foreign policy, not simply about Trump foreign policy. So the policy of the administration, as we've seen regarding Russia, has not been bad at all. And that's been true on a fair number of policy issues. And what we've seen in this period is not just how senior members of the administration move the president away from his instincts, but how American institutions, Congress, but also some American NGOs, not excluding the Atlantic Council, have been able to maintain relationships which have been unbalanced by some of the president's more intemperate remarks. But managing this is much more difficult, and it would be better if we didn't have to manage it.
Thank you. Will?
So the president's job is not to be popular abroad. I'm not naive enough to say it doesn't matter. It's nice to have other countries think well of you. But I think the key is for the president, the administration, to do what is in America's national interest, strictly defined. And I think if that makes you unpopular in some places, it might say more about the other places than whether you're good or bad at your job. So for example, President Trump could have not brought up the issue of alliance burden sharing. He could have just been content with Germany spending 1.2% of GDP and spending it not too well. Or he could have tried to press the Germans on this issue, which could make him less popular. I think that it's, again, I'd rather have the President of the United States do a really great job for Americans than to have a big audience in whatever square he's speaking in abroad. Again, it's good if others like you, but you got to put American interests first, second, and third. And I think that's what's so critical. And sometimes that means doing things that might make others happy, and sometimes not so happy. Now, I do believe that, and again, I'm not trying to curry favor with our ambassadors here, but you have to have a robust diplomatic corps. And that's important because that can do a lot of the work to help explain what your policies are and why you're doing them. And sometimes that means friction, sometimes that means unhappiness, or sometimes it means favor. And that's why we do need to have a robust diplomatic corps, and that's something that hopefully Secretary Pompeo will improve upon. But again, it's not a global popularity contest. We could be popular being taken advantage of, and the United States has been taken advantage of too often by countries outside the United States.
Dr. Wallader, go ahead.
Just to agree with Willie that the American president does need to put American interests first. And I think that Barack Obama put American interests first. And it was the Obama administration, first Secretary Gates, and then Secretary Carter, and the White House, who pressed on the 2% issue and got actually an agreement of the allies that they would work towards it. They didn't all achieve it. They still haven't all achieved it. And in some ways, the less than diplomatic style of President Trump has actually made it harder, I'm told, when I'm in Europe, because now it's a domestic political issue. It was always a domestic political issue in Europe, budgets, spending more on defense. But European governments can't, some can, but not all and not many, can look like they are reaching 2% because they're being bullied by the American president, because those leaders have to do what's in their country's national interests, and they can't look like they are simply being, agents of a undiplomatic American president. So I both agree with Will, but I want to be clear. It is not just about the issue of burden sharing, it's also how you do it. That speaks to being an effective president on the international scene and advancing American national interests rather than setting them back. And I think the way Trump has done this has actually set us back in Europe.
Yeah, I'm enjoying agreeing with Dr. Wallander. It's great. Just a little nuance on kind of part of my argument. If you think about something like Libya, Libya was done for one and two reasons. One, because of the doctrine of responsibility to protect that was promoted by certain figures within the Obama administration. And two, was that we were chain ganged, we were pushed into the conflict by our allies. Neither one of those was putting American interests first. I would also argue that we weren't really putting the interests of Libyans and people in Mali and other people in North Africa first because of the unintended consequences of our engagement there. They were bad for others, but also bad for the United States. And so I think one of the things that I appreciate about this president is that some of his instincts on wars in the Middle East is this good for the United States? Now I worry that he thinks, or some people think in the administration, that war with Iran will be good with the United States. But I think when it comes to Syria and Afghanistan and his view on other things, that there is a sense like, hey, I don't think this was good for us.
Dr. Sestanovich, is he right? Has Trump's policies broadly promoted U.S. interests?
Melinda, we need to let the audience ask us some questions, because I think my answer to that is obvious, no. But it's not because he's wrong about every single point. I mean, Celeste and Will have said, yeah, right about burden sharing, but what's foolish about that issue is that American contributions to European security have gone down radically in the 25 years since the Cold War ended, 30 years, and nobody's talking, in the Trump administration is really talking about that. You have some people in the Defense Department doing it. But what the president doesn't even know is that America's role in promoting European security has gone down. And the United States, although it spends much more than 2%, has to ask itself, what is its contribution to European security, and is it in the American national interest? And the answer is, our contribution has gone way down, and of course it would be in the national interest to think seriously about that.
Great, thank you so much. Let's open it up to the audience. I'm going to take Orsia right here in the orange coat. And please identify yourself, your name and your affiliation, and please ask a question. Please don't make statements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melinda. Orisia Lutsevich, I manage Ukraine Forum in Chatham House. Since we are in Kiev and we hear a lot of pledge actually from Ukraine that it's ready for burden sharing. It's ready to contain Russia, but I don't think this really is trusted by our Western allies as is a credible proposition today. So if you put yourself in Ukraine's shoes and if you want to protect Ukrainian national interest, maybe it's a question to William and Celeste, what would you do today in Ukraine to build this policy proposition as credible and trustworthy? Thank you.
To join NATO?
To become, I didn't say about joining NATO. I said, how do we make our Western allies trustworthy in the message of Ukraine that it's ready in burden sharing and that it can perhaps contain Russia?
Do you want to collect or do you want
No, please go ahead.
Okay.
And please try to keep it to like about 3 sentences, 4 sentences maybe.
So I actually think that, so during the first term of the Obama administration, I was responsible for defense relations with Ukraine, which was a great privilege, although it's a little heartbreaking because I did get to go to Sevastopol, and I don't think I'll ever get to go again and see Ukrainian Navy in Sevastopol, not in my lifetime. I hope so, but. And we were really frustrated, though, that while the Navy, the Ukrainian Navy, was forward-thinking and reform and getting away from a Soviet structure and a Soviet past, we were having trouble with the Army and the Air Force, kind of, complacency. When I now review what the Ukrainian Army in particular has been able to do by necessity, fighting a war with a huge neighbor, but also by creativity, good diplomacy, and good relations in bilateral cooperation with the United States among them, I actually think you're now doing exactly what you need to do. You're willing to think about pulling apart and putting back together what was still basically a Soviet Ministry of Defense and a Soviet armed forces. And that's really hard to do anyway. It's really hard to do when you're fighting a war at the same time. So that practical focus, and that's why I asked about NATO. I think NATO is great as an aspiration, but the bad thing about the NATO aspiration for countries in this region is that it can become a distraction from the everyday practical work and how you can best achieve it. And I think the focus on that bilateral defense cooperation, on building the economy, having the foundation of national power is not your military. The foundation of national power is your economy. And so not only focus on the military, but focus on a strong, diverse, integrated, modern, dynamic, innovative economy that can build a better life for Ukrainians, but also provide that foundation that then will be a long, long contribution to Ukraine's defense and Ukraine's contribution to defense in this part of the world for all of us.
We'll do it, no? Okay, Bogdan Nahilo.
Thank you very much. Distinguished panel, could you give us a better sense of the importance of Ukraine for Capitol Hill these days? How serious is it taken? Is it just another problem, one of these frozen problems on the back burner somewhere, given Venezuela, given Merkel leaving, given so many Brexit, etc.? Just how much attention is it getting? Secondly, given that we might be having a change of president here, is this going to worry people in Washington, or what would be your advice be to whoever wins, how to maintain that attention from Washington, to maintain that attention span, shall we say, prolong it? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Ambassador Herbst, will you take that one? And then I'll come down. Both, please.
Ukraine, or Russia's war in Ukraine, does not receive a great deal of attention broadly, you might say, in our political system. And when I say political system, I mean you're talking about political leaders, you're talking about our media. It does receive a great deal of attention, however, at a little bit lower levels in our government. The people who are responsible for both Russia and Ukraine are paying very close attention. And they have sufficient access, certainly to the Secretary of State, to the National Security Director, and also at senior levels of the Pentagon, so that their views are made known and their recommendations are often accepted. But in Congress, there's a largish group, Democrat and Republican, who pay attention to these issues, and that attention, from the perspective of most Ukrainians, is very, very positive. So I think that in terms of the American political system, support for sensible policies is quite strong, and the prospect of those policies changing in the wrong direction, even after the Mueller report, are very slim. Now, your second question on?
Possible change of presidency.
Right. I think there is a little bit of concern regarding the still not well-known Mr. Zelensky. I would not overstate that. The American government certainly had no candidate in this election. They wanted the Ukrainian people to vote the next president of Ukraine. And from talking to officials responsible for policy who understand the country, they are waiting to deal with the next president of Ukraine, whether that's Mr. Poroshenko again or Mr. Zelensky. So I expect our policy to continue.
Will? No?
One sentence on
Stephen, go
this.
ahead. Sure,
If
Stephen,
I,
Sandy.
just a friendly criticism of Ukrainian approach to this. I think you've probably been too reliant on friends in the U.S. Congress, and it would help you to diversify those efforts, and in particular, I would say, to strengthen the kind of interest and support and policy direction of European governments, because Americans need to hear from European governments what they see as the role of Ukraine in their own security. And I don't think they hear enough about that.
That's a great point. Sandy, I think you also wanted.
Yeah, just briefly, I think the number of people who really have an understanding of the importance of Ukraine is very small. I mean, there are activists, but I do think those who shape the policy and think about these issues recognize that the future of Ukraine is kind of a pivotal factor in the future of European security in Europe. So I think there is an appreciation among those who think about strategy that the stakes are very high in Ukraine, and I think that's why you've seen the continued support from administration to administration. But getting that case across to the general public at a time of retrenchment, which I think is what we've been hearing, as a description of Trump's policy, is going to become harder and harder. And I think Ukraine has to make the case for itself that it's a going concern, that it is reforming, that it is taking care of its own defenses in order to generate the kind of support that is needed, given how high those stakes are.
Great. Thank you, Sandy. I had a question over here, please.
Павло Жоняренко, Київ. Я маю, дозволю собі питання, яке стосується політики Сполучених Штатів.
I would like to ask a question about the US policies.
На історії.
And I would base it on the history, on the historic perspective, but it actually touches upon the current situation.
Займатися собою – це
Naturally, thinking about oneself, one's national interests, this is of paramount importance. But history teaches us that when the US concentrate only within themselves or their territory, then forces in Europe and elsewhere in the world wanted to wage wars and take any territory they could in their possession. The US have understood this after the Second World War. And I believe the Third World War was happily not there because the deterring Soviet Union turned into the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Whether you see any parallels in what Russia does now with what dictators like Stalin and Hitler did in those earlier times, so that you should actually erase Russia rather than deter it.
The most important thing to say is that Putin's Russia is not Stalin or even Brezhnev's Soviet Union. It is a far lesser threat to the United States or to its neighbors than the Soviet Union, which is not to say it's not a threat. I think Russia is the greatest immediate threat to American security, but not Putin's Russia. But that's not as large a threat as, again, the Soviet threat was. There are some minor parallels, but Putin is not a world-class rogue or a historical rogue the way that Stalin or Hitler were. And we can easily manage the Putin problem if we understand our strength and act accordingly. And I think we are in the process of doing that, but we haven't quite achieved the strongest policy that we need. And some of us are working to encourage that result.
Great. Can I add one? Yes, please.
Because this is important in a European audience, too, which is the other piece of the strategic competitors, is the United States is dealing with two challenges at the same, well, more, but further down the line, because I mostly agree about the prioritization, which is a rising China and a resurgent Russia. And so from a European perspective, it's really important to understand that some of your frustration with us is you're going to have to learn how to effectively manage that in messaging the United States, because I agree with Steve about the reduction in commitment to defense in Europe and that it definitely overdid it. Part of it was necessary, though, because the United States has national interests in Asia and is facing a rising peer competitor when we also have alliance commitments in Asia. So helping us figure out, don't make us make it one or the other, because I just feel like that's going to be a losing strategy. Help us figure out how to manage the two of them at the same time.
Thank you so much. I have a question here, please.
Thank you, Marina Krolevets, Odessa National University. My question is regarding the non-proliferation policy of the United States. So recently the INF Treaty has been withdrawn, and what is your opinion on that issue? Because that was a unique treaty that declared like the reducing the whole class of nuclear weapons. And the second part of the question is regarding the New START Treaty. So it ends in 2021, and still there are no negotiations between Russia and the US regarding the new treaty or regarding the prolonging of New START. So what steps should be taken by the American administration regarding the next treaty that will just make this dangerous sphere in nuclear policy like to be safer?
Thank you so much. Sandy?
The INF Treaty was quite an achievement in its time in terms of banning a whole class of nuclear weapons. It really was a pivotal event in the end of the Cold War. But unfortunately, the Russians have chosen to violate it. They may have thought they could get away with it, but they didn't. And so there's a legal basis for the Trump administration's decision to withdraw from the treaty. And I think they've handled it reasonably well in terms of consulting with allies, giving the Russians several last chances to come back into compliance, but they haven't done it. But at the same time, whether our taking the lead in withdrawing has basically played into the Russians' hands, at least in the short term, is how I feel. I think it's been legally justifiable, but politically doubtful that we should have proceeded as quickly, because the Russians have lots of new systems in development. They may be better positioned to deploy more of these systems than we are. And I think the case is fairly strong for pursuing some kind of at least successor agreement. If we can't save the INF Treaty as it is, we might try to at least ban nuclear versions of the INF system that the Russians have deployed, or limit the numbers of the systems that are permitted to avoid an action-reaction cycle. But I don't expect the Trump administration to go for that. John Bolton doesn't like arms control, and there is a case that we could benefit from deploying some of these systems, particularly in Asia, as a counterweight to China. What this implies for the New START agreement is unclear. There were some statements I saw just in the last day or two, both quoting the President and Secretary Pompeo as kind of leaving the door open to an extension or renegotiation of the New START treaty. Because without that, there would be no legally binding, verifiable constraints, and we would also lose a lot of access to Russian information about their strategic systems, which provides a certain amount of predictability. So there's still hope that New START may be saved, but I don't see the prospect for the Trump administration pursuing a new agreement on INF.
Okay, this gentleman right here, please.
Георгій Манчуленко. Звісно, що Сполучені Штати Америки надали Україні
Well, if we speak what the American counterparts have given a very important support to Ukraine in terms of sanctions, in terms of military support and lethal armaments. We haven't received any such support from any other country, neither in the European continent nor elsewhere. But if we look from the perspective of the Budapest Memorandum, this aid, this assistance is not enough. Ukraine has lost a substantial potential, and if you turn it into the financial equivalent, this becomes even greater. Ukraine now faces yet another challenge, which relates to the so-called major pipelines. We speak here about North Stream and South Stream. Mr. Trump was speaking about categoric refusal to accept Nord Stream 2 and potential implementation of sanctions, imposition of sanctions. But unfortunately, sanctions have not yet been imposed. And I would like to hear your opinion. Who's blocking sanctions for Nord Stream 2 and those structures who implement Nord Stream 2? And what U.S., or rather American administration, contemplates to do with the South Stream? Because this is yet another jeopardy for Ukraine, because if we lose our transiting status, then Russian aggression can continue further on.
We at the Atlantic Council have been outspoken.
В Атлантичній Раді ми завжди чітко говорили про те, що не сприймаємо ідеї Північного потоку. І завжди наполягали на введенні санкцій в зв'язку з агресивною політикою Росії. Чому Штати не ввели санкцій? Тому що це може зашкодити солідарності у Європейському Союзі. Це одне й те саме питання. Північний поток-2. Президент Трамп постійно говорив про те, що буде вводити санкції у зв'язку з цим проєктом. Не можу виключити того, що це трапиться, попри те, що в Берліні це викличе певні незадоволення і у деяких європейських столицях. Чому цього не сталося? Меркель
Ukraine as a carrier of gas from Russia to Europe, and that a certain amount of BCMs of Russian gas should be assured through Ukraine's pipelines. But over the last 6 weeks, Russian figures have several times called that commitment into question. Medvedev and Novak have said, Novak, the energy minister, Medvedev, the prime minister of Russia, have said separately that there are various conditions that must be met by Ukraine for that to happen. And those conditions are unacceptable. And then also the Russians let Bulgaria and I think Romania know a couple of weeks ago that Russian supplying of gas to Ukraine would end in 2020. So they are making a mockery of Merkel's commitment. And that could be an opening for the United States to be more assertive in working against the implementation of Nord Stream 2. So while many people think Nord Stream 2 is a certainty, I believe it quite possibly could fail. And it certainly deserves to enter the dustbin of history. As for South Stream or Turk Stream, the Black Sea variation of Nord Stream 2, you can be sure that people in Washington who understand that Nord Stream 2 is not a wonderful project also recognize these projects as a problem. They receive some attention, but not as much because they are far less along than Nord Stream 2. And difficulties in the always interesting and problematic Turkish-Russian relationship are principally responsible for that those projects are not moving so fast. But right now we're in a springtime of Turkish-Russian relations, and that project is picking up some momentum. But you can be sure we're paying attention.
Thanks, John. Jock?
Jock Mendoza-Wilson, System Capital Management Group. I just made a brief comment and a very brief question. Firstly, I must say I express my agreement with Celeste Wallander on her comment regarding Russia, believing that their intervention in Donbass is a success. I'm fortunate enough to participate in a number of Track 2 discussions, and that's certainly the feedback we get from our interlocutors. But to the question, because I know that you don't want any long statements, it's a pretty simple one. I mean, the American headlines, American media, and American media influence on Ukraine and Europe has been all about the Mueller inquiry until very recently. And it seems to, for someone who visits the US regularly, have changed the sanity of American media and American politics. Now that that inquiry has, we hope, come to a close, although I know there's still demands for a report to be published, do you think we can return to a more partisan types of politics, or are we still going to be in this conflictual situation in American politics for the next 2 years up to and including the next presidential elections?
That's a great question. Who wants to jump in? Who's
Sure.
brave? Okay, go ahead, Celeste.
They're all looking at me anyway, so I had to. I don't think it's over. There is the tug of war over releasing the full report and the information on which that was gathered in the course of a report that ended up 400 pages. A 4-page summary is a little skimpy. And there is already enough publicly known about Russian actions, about activities of Trump campaign officials in meeting with Russians. Paul Manafort shared public opinion polling data with a Russian who was connected to Russian security services, that this issue, I'm just declaring factually, is not going to go away. I think that it's a legitimate issue. Not everyone would agree with me, but I do feel that the hype around it and our own media space is not helping Americans, let alone the world, understand the important issues and understand which ones have been resolved and which ones not. I don't know how to fix that, because any fix to our information space on our own runs up against, our basic freedoms, freedom of information, freedom of political debate. So I think it's reflecting fundamental disagreements and fundamental fears and concerns. It's not creating them. And so therefore, I think it's going to be a reality for this year. It's going to be a reality for next year. I told Russians 2 years ago, you're going to be living with this for 4 years. And they didn't believe me. They kind of, when I talk to them now, they kind of believe me. So I just think you better take a deep breath and be ready for this to not go away.
Or just turn off the TV, Jack. That's the other option. Will, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that polarization is remarkably high in Washington, but I think it's important for a foreign audience to hear something else too, because I think this is underreported on, probably internationally, which is that there have been some real examples of bipartisanship where you've seen people actually working together. And at the Koch network that I work in, we really try to find those avenues to try to engage with others to do good. So for example, criminal justice reform is a big issue in the United States, and you've seen massive bipartisan support at both the federal and the state level, because a lot of criminal justice policy in the United States is done actually at the subunits. But even at the national unit, where you saw, again, Republicans and Democrats, including President Trump, do some of this reform. The other thing is in foreign policy, you recently had a bipartisan agreement on Yemen, where you saw people like us and people like Ro Khanna working together to promote greater restrictions coming from Congress on our support to Saudi Arabia in that awful war. And so again, you hear polarization, there's no doubt it's happening, but we need to remember that the American political system is still functioning to solve many problems. And I think the sense in the media, even in the United States, is that this is in disarray, it's terrible. No, we're all still doing a lot of the same things, and our institutions are still strong.
Great. Stephen, did you want to jump in?
I'll just say one thing. It is clear that the Mueller report, as we understand it, has confirmed the Democrats in one conviction which they already had, which is impeachment is not the line of policy for the foreseeable future unless something else is discovered that they don't know. However, it is also, at the same time, the Democrats' line of policy to pursue a whole range of other investigations of the president. So you're going to have a lot of that same kind of confrontation.
Great, thank you. I have two questions right here, and then I have Brian Whitmore. So let's take these two guys, and then Brian Whitmore, if we can get a mic over here. Brian, raise your hand so I can get a mic to him. Go ahead, please.
Володимир Бондаренко, Інститут політичних та маркетингових.
Volodymyr Bondarenko, Institute for Political Studies. Our institute has been very lucky because we have foreseen the presidency of Mr. Trump. It is only our pundits are able to do that. Now you can tell us whether the Trump administration, once the newly elected Ukrainian president is going to support strategic initiatives in the defense of this defense sector strategy that we have referred to earlier, to the effect that we will initiate a joint anti-aircraft defense system, it will be playing into the hands of President Trump included.
I'm going to take a few questions, and then we'll go down. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, Ekaterina Shengele from Primy. I just first want to voice my appreciation toward William Ruger's words regarding the change of the shift of paradigm after the election of Trump. And my question to all of our speakers is, do you think that Trump's election, which, as most people agree, did change the way Americans thought about their own country, do you think that it was for better or worse? And my second...
No, one question, please.
Sorry.
Thank you. Brian?
Yeah, I just got a quick two-finger follow-up on the question on the Mueller report, and I'd like to hear possibly from each of the panelists. What is it going to take to get the issue of Russian malign influence out of the realm of partisan politics and into the realm of bipartisan national security, where it belongs, or is this even possible to do right now? Because this is a serious national security issue that has turned into a partisan issue. That's my question.
Great,
It's
thank
bugging
you.
me.
Okay, we're almost out of time, so get your
So
microphones ready, please.
quickly, I won't speak for the Trump administration in specific support for that defense initiative, but I think that I would just point out that I think that the U.S. Will recognize the results of free and fair elections and work with the Ukrainian government and the either returning president or the new president, regardless, as long as the procedures are right and the Ukrainian people speak freely. I just want to endorse something I think several of us have said. I think that Trump's election is reflecting real views within the American population. So I don't think Trump has changed those views. He has, in this sense, surfaced really important issues that the American political class and our whole country is going to have to deal with. Hopefully we will in the next election. Hopefully it won't only be about the Mueller report. So I completely agree that we have real issues and that those have to be taken seriously and will be important in the election. And on the issue of what I actually think that the national security establishment in the United States this gets back to what's in the headlines versus what's being done. There was a concerted focus on preventing Russian interference in the 2018 midterm elections. I don't think they tried very hard, but I'm sure they were probing. There actually is a lot of work that is going on in the bureaucracy of the United States. The toxic issue is, frankly, did it affect the outcome? And there's huge disagreement on that. But that's not important for what you're asking. What you're asking is the national security apparatus of the United States taking this seriously? But I don't think it's going to get taken care of by the political establishment, and it is being addressed by the experts inside the government.
Okay, Will?
Yeah, and first of all, I just want to thank Ukraine for making my first visit here. It's so wonderful. It's been enjoyable to be here, and I've loved Kiev. One thing I would say, we kind of almost as a closing statement, is that a lot of these conversations that are now open in Washington are going to have big ramifications for Europe and Asia and Africa and other parts of the world. And I think it's really important that you study the range of opinion there, because I think that the Cold War consensus that then led to a kind of post-Cold War consensus on steroids is broken down. And these changes, these different conversations are going to have a big impact when it comes to, say, the future of NATO, whether Ukraine and Georgia can join NATO, how the United States is going to deal with the rise of China. And so pay attention and maybe buckle up.
Great, thank you. Stephen, any final thoughts or responses?
Yeah, we're ending on a too harmonious note here.
Oh, please throw something in.
And I don't share it. I think there's the correct picture of American foreign policy debate over many decades is that when there's a big disaster, then there's a retrenchment. When the disaster is caused by a kind of overactivism, people say, maybe we overdid it. So in the 50s, after Korea, in the 70s, after Vietnam, in the 90s, briefly after the end of the Cold War, there were people who said you needed a downsized American foreign policy, and the election of Barack Obama was the same kind of vote for retrenchment that you had had before, and the reason is obvious, because the Iraq War was, as John Herbst in a nice term said, as a complete disaster. But what always happens after those debates about retrenchment is that people say, gee, are we going too far? Are we actually developing kind of crazy policies that make the world worse? And that's why at the end of the 50s, you had a repudiation of too much retrenchment. At the end of the 70s, people said, Jimmy Carter, do we really want that? In the mid-90s, people said, you know, if the United States only believes that it's the economy stupid, the world is going to go to hell. And so there was a reassertion of an activist policy. I believe that the Donald Trump administration is going to lead to the kind of debate that makes people say, oh, gee, we didn't really want that, not something that awful. And so you're going to get a new consensus about a restored American involvement in the world, which will be different, because it's always different. But it's going to involve a kind of coming together and a realization that we didn't mean this.
So I want to jump in. Keep thinking that, because then you'll underestimate the critics. The fact is the world is a very different place than after those times, and there's going to be real change in American foreign policy, whether you like it or not.
Great, thank you. Sandy, one last final thought, and one last final thought from John, then I have to turn it back over to David.
Yeah. Well, there's always change in American foreign policy, but I'm not sure we're going to see such a coherent debate in the remaining 2 years of the administration. But I mean, to the question of did Trump's election make things better or worse, I'm particularly worried about its impact on the whole American political culture. I mean, Trump is persistently undermining respect for the law, for the truth, and for some of our basic institutions. He's contributing to a polarization on partisan lines, on racial and ethnic lines. And he's undermining America's standing as a role model for the rest of the world, perhaps for a long time to come. So that's what worries me more. I mean, I think some of the policies are coming out right, maybe more by accident than by design. We just have to kind of hold our breath and hope that on NATO and Russia and Ukraine, this hardline approach continues. But it could veer off in some totally different direction if we have a bad figure for German car exports, which leads Trump to kind of crack down on Merkel, pull out of NATO. No, it wouldn't get that bad, but you could see sort of erratic behavior still possible. But so I'm much more worried, though, about our standing in the world with this, the non-leadership we're getting on values, on the moral leadership that America has traditionally represented.
Thank you, Sandy. John, one last final
On the
thought?
specific question about joint cooperation on anti-aircraft, anti-missile defense, I think this is a conversation which is just beginning, and I suspect that there will be people in Washington willing to have this conversation. Where it precisely goes is a question, but the conversation is very much on the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please put your hands together and help me thank our fantastic panel. Thank you for having us. I'd like to thank Danila and Mr. Yatsenuk again for giving us this opportunity. Now, back over to David.
Well, Melinda, thank you too for marshalling that panel, which was a wonderful mélange of agreement and disagreement. Thank you very much, one and all.